Hello, everybody. My name is Scott Leon. I'm a researcher at the Wellesley Institute in Toronto. The Wellesley Institute is a nonprofit research and policy organization, and our mandate is to improve health and health equity in the Greater Toronto Area through policy action and program action on the social determinants of health. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about some research that I've been doing on evictions. And I thought I'd start off by saying a little bit about how I got first engaged with evictions in the city of Toronto way back in 2018. So for the past 5 years, I've been working with a number of youth shelters and CAMH supporting youth as they transition out of homelessness and into more permanent housing. And I would see the intense effort and energy that the youth put in, that social workers put in, that the social service sector put in to helping youth transition into housing. And then again and again, I would see these gains wiped away from evictions, often for a small amount of arrears or for conflicts with the landlord or other problems that would seem to me to be surmountable. So then I started asking, what's going on with evictions in the city of Toronto? How many are there? Where are they? Who's most at risk? Some pretty basic questions. And through some searching, there had not been very much research on evictions in the city of Toronto for around 15 years. So I thought I would start addressing that through some research. And I think I can share my screen here. Can everyone see this? Yeah? Okay, good stuff. There's my name and my Twitter handle. If anyone likes Twitter, it's Scott Leon, at Scott Leon TO. And so I wrote up this paper with my colleague, James Ivanuk, called Forced Out. Thanks, Lauren, for introducing this. On looking at formal eviction applications in the city of Toronto from 2010 to 2018. And this is out on our website now. If you Google Forced Out Wellesley Institute, it'll pop up. Or just check the Wellesley Institute website or my Twitter, and you'll be able to find a link to it. And you'll find more information there. So as I said, just kind of looking at what are the numbers and rates of formal eviction applications in the city of Toronto? Where are they being filed for? So what's their geographic distribution? And who's most at risk? And the Landlord and Tenant Board, which is the primary source of data for this research project, they don't ask about income or race or other sociodemographic factors when eviction applications are filed. So we kind of have to use a second best method, which is correlating Census 2016 sociodemographic data of census tracts with eviction filing rates of those census tracts and seeing the correlations there. So as I mentioned, the main source of data for this paper is administrative data from the Landlord and Tenant Board on formal eviction applications. And I want to say that formal eviction applications are one step in the formal eviction process. These applications trigger a hearing at the Landlord and Tenant Board, and they can, but do not always result in an eviction or a forced move. There are countless informal, illegal, and eviction threats and evictions without documentation that this paper isn't able to discern. So we're looking at one kind of phase here. And so what we found, one of the big headline numbers, is there's 20,000 formal eviction applications in the city of Toronto in 2018 alone. So over a study period, it was almost 200,000 formal eviction applications. This is roughly one eviction application for every 20 renter households. So it shows quite a bit of scale, and this is only a subset of the evictions and evictions threats, as I discussed earlier. I don't know if this will work. Hopefully that works for other people. This is a GIF I made, and so these aren't COVID cases. These are formal eviction applications filed in the city of Toronto in 2018. So each dot is one formal eviction application, and as it scrolls in around 15 seconds, it scrolls through the year. And this kind of gives you a sense of the pace, not so much the distribution, but the pace of formal eviction filings in the city of Toronto. When looking at kind of longer term trends, we see a slight decrease from around 25,000 to 20,000 formal eviction applications filed in the city of Toronto every year. In the paper, I go into a little bit more detail why I think this might be the case, kind of hypothesize, but I'm not going to explain that too much here. So looking at where formal eviction applications are filed, we see that some neighborhoods have eviction filing rates 4 times higher than the city of Toronto average. And so the eviction filing rates we calculated by dividing the number of formal eviction applications by the number of renter households in each area. So in this case, neighborhoods, in the case of our regression model, which I'll get into census tracts. So this controls the number of renters. And we see citywide, as I mentioned, that one formal eviction application every year for every 20 renter households. But in some areas, this increases to one formal eviction application for every 5 renter households. In some buildings in North York, in particular the Palisades, in some years we see a formal eviction application for every 2 renter households a year. So there's really spiky, uneven distribution and an inequitable distribution, as I'll show you in a sec. So when we map these out, these are just raw numbers of eviction applications. We see that they're disproportionately kind of distributed across the city of Toronto. So we see areas like Parkdale having high numbers of eviction applications. We see some areas in North York, and particularly along Jane and just east of that, having high numbers of eviction applications. Some areas along Eglinton in Scarborough. And then when we control for the number of renter households so we can get rates, we see some similarities and some differences. So again, we really see these areas in North York stand out as high numbers and high rates of eviction applications, high eviction filing rates. Looking at rates, some other neighborhoods stand out, in particular Weston Mount Dennis, Parkdale again, Crescent Town, and some areas in Scarborough. So then the next question was who's most at risk? And again, these aren't individual level associations, these are ecological. So what are the socio-demographic characteristics of census tracts that have high or low eviction filing rates? And so we built a regression model with a number of control variables. So we look at renter poverty, racialization, subsidized housing, age, gender, immigration status. And I think that's all the factors. There might be some more control variables in there. And when we run this regression model, we see 3 factors really stand out. The first might not be surprising, but it's still very troubling, is renter poverty. So we see as renter poverty increases in a census tract from 21% to 50%, we see eviction filing rates more than double. And this is quite a straight linear line, which shows kind of the tightness of the association. The second one that stands out, which is more promising, is subsidized housing. So neighborhoods or census tracts with more subsidized housing have significantly lower eviction filing rates, all other factors being held equal. So this shows one promising policy solution to addressing evictions long term. So nonprofit and public social housing, affordable housing. And then the third factor, which really stood out for us, and I think this is increasingly, there's a lot of profile around this in our society right now, rightfully so, is race and racism. So we found that census tracts with more Black renter households in them have significantly higher, twice as high eviction filing rates, holding everything else equal. And this really shows that Toronto has a racialized eviction problem, that systemic and individual anti-Black racism plays a part and operates through, in part, evictions and the housing system. This is kind of seeing that association in another way, kind of geographically. So the orange circles are eviction filing rates. The purple background is the % Black renter households. And we can see, especially in North York, in the areas identified earlier along Jane Street and near there, high numbers of eviction applications, and then also this correlation with where Black Torontonians live. But this association is also driven by neighborhoods that tend to have less Black renter households in them and significantly lower eviction filing rates. And so we can see that this correlation is in part driven by these areas in North York, where they've got really high numbers of eviction applications, really high rates, and where we're seeing this correlation in the disparity for Black renter households. So that brings us to the next phase of research that we're starting now, which is doing a case study of these neighborhoods, in particular these high eviction filing rates neighborhoods. So we're doing a mixed methods case study. So I'll be doing some analysis of formal eviction applications on a longer timeline. So also looking at 2019 and during the pandemic, what's happening in these areas. We're also doing some qualitative research. So the first phase, that forced out paper, is really a quantitative piece, and it looks at evictions through that lens. But I think to really broaden our understanding and figure out how to understand community knowledge and experience, and be able to leverage this for policy change to reduce evictions, their harm, and their disparities, we really need to talk to people real on-the-ground experts, tenants, service providers, community leaders. And we'll be starting these interviews hopefully next month. We had planned to start them earlier, but the pandemic threw everything off. Now we've pivoted to digital interviews, and we're also going to save some interviews for in-person tenant interviews, hopefully next year, but we're going to play that one by ear. So I mentioned the areas that we're looking at. This is a partnership with the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit, which are just amazing people. They're a great partner, really amazing to work with. And they funded basically a stratified sample to highlight and make sure that we capture the Black experience of evictions. And we're going to feed our findings into Confronting Anti-Black Racism's reports to Council in their action plans to address systemic anti-Black racism in the City of Toronto, in particular through housing and evictions. This gets me to kind of these 3 points that I really kind of want to hammer home as well. Why must we reduce evictions? This list is long, but I'm going to focus just on 3 really quickly here. The first is that Toronto has a racialized eviction problem, and if we're serious about reducing systemic disparities for Black Torontonians, we need to act. We need to go beyond just, well, we want to do something about this, to actually doing it. And we're going to have to see policy action to realize this. And if we don't, then I don't think our politicians are putting their money in their actions where their mouth is. The second is that evictions spread COVID-19. And continuing with evictions and a wave of evictions will damage our pandemic response. One of the most common responses to evictions when people are evicted is to move in, at least temporarily, with friends or relatives. This often means sleeping on couches, doubling or even tripling up in apartments. And we know that overcrowding in housing increases the spread of infectious diseases, and COVID-19 is no different. Also, this is another way that evictions damage not just the individual renter households that are being evicted, and we know that there's significant cascading impacts on the health and well-being of tenants that are evicted, but this also spirals out into households that are, having friends or relatives stay with them, and the wider society, homeowners, and our society in general. So it's not just the renters that are impacted. Well, that's the main thing. This has cascading impacts on our city and on our country, Ontario, Canada. And the third is that evictions contribute to homelessness. Well, the number of people that are evicted, only a small minority of them enter like long-term or kind of rough sleeping or homelessness in general. When you ask people who are experiencing homelessness, why are they evicted? Or why are they homeless? What was the main cause of this current spell of homelessness? The third most cited reason is eviction. So quite a few people that are experiencing homelessness have gone through eviction and have gone through it recently. And it's the reason for their current homelessness. So I think those are 3 big reasons. I know we could go into longer, but why they need to be addressed. But these, I think, are really the important ones to take away now to spur us to immediate action. And that gets me into our next steps, which is kind of a policy response. So the first paper was really about trying to convince politicians and policymakers that something needs to be done. And we heard from ministers at the provincial level, federal cabinet, city politicians, public servants across 3 levels of government, landlords, tenant organizations. But from government, we heard that, okay, we see this. We know something has to be done. We know that evictions are a facet of anti-Black racism in the City of Toronto. We know they're going to damage our COVID response. But now we actually need to get politicians and the governments to move to actually doing something. So moving from we want to do something to that we're going to do something. And as anyone that's probably is engaged in policy research, this can be a frustrating and time-consuming undertaking. That's really where we're going next. So we've got a literature review. We're hoping to do some convening from different stakeholders around evictions, try to build some mutual understanding of the problems and the solutions, and do some government relations to try to push these through cabinet effectively. And I won't go into all the different policy responses, but I want to highlight a few. The first one is rent banks with grants. So these are sometimes called arrears protection programs, but these are effectively for people that are in arrears, interest-free loans or forgivable grants for people that are facing these arrears so that they can maintain their tenancies. Another really promising response is legal aid services. So we've seen this in New York City, as well as through the Tenant Duty Council operating in Ontario, that roughly, I think it's only like 2% of tenants facing eviction have legal representation, whilst it's like 80% for landlords. We see that this contributes to the power dynamics and power imbalances between tenants and landlords. And when tenants don't have legal representation and aren't aware of their rights, we often see them losing an eviction hearings. So I'll kind of, and the last one I think I'd like to talk about is long-term affordable housing development as well as acquisition. Acquisition is acquiring buildings where tenants are currently living to provide them as social or affordable housing. I think this is a really promising response. And the last one would be the potential for a second wave eviction moratorium as cases spike again. And I've also got a short report coming out soon looking at formal eviction applications during that period. So from the start of the declaration of the state of emergency in March through to the end of July, early August, when evictions started back up again. And I'm hoping to have that published in the next couple months, let's say. So that's my presentation. Thank you for listening. If you ever have any questions, you can send me an email at scott@wellesleyinstitute.com. I'm pretty active on Twitter sometimes, or you can give me a call. My number is on the Wellesley Institute website. I'm always happy to talk more about this. Thank you.